You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast. And welcome to Spookulative Evolution.
Hello, David.
Well?
And hello, listeners. Welcome to our second episode of Spook-E 2024.
Spookulative Evolution.
Where we continue our Halloween-themed series of evolving monsters, creatures, and critters from myth and fiction, and saying what would it take for some of these things to actually be a real creature. You know, what evolutionary pressures, what type of animal, what things would lead to something that looks like, in this case, fairies.
Fairies! We're doing tiny monsters this year.
Yes, indeed.
So this was another one that had to be on this list.
Obviously. Tiny monsters, including whatever was small enough and fit what we thought would be fun enough. Yeah. Something who knows what else is going to show up.
Something that was small.
Yes.
It was small and sort of a monster.
This episode, we are doing fairies, which are kind of an interesting one because I don't know that most people would list them as monsters.
Yeah, and indeed, for a little behind-the-scenes glimpse, originally this was our idea for Cutie this year.
But it's not anymore.
But it's not. Here it is in the monster list.
This is also kind of like when we were doing dragons. This is one of those where we're going to go over the history before we do, so that we can get a background of what kind of creature we're dealing with. You could do a college course
on fairies.
On the history of fairies.
Absolutely.
They're one of the most ubiquitous mythical creatures in at least European mythos. But even going outside of there's tons of creatures similar to them. They are originated. They did not come from one place.
They're polyphyletic.
Yes, extremely so. And super diverse. There's been stories going back thousands of years. Mm-hmm. So this will be the slightest of glimpses into fairy history. I also preface this because I know that there's going to be a lot of people who are fans of, because it's fairies.
Sure, absolutely.
So if I skip over something or if I sum up something particularly simply, give me a break.
like with dragons and a lot of the other monsters we've done in Spook-E, we're looking at a narrow view for the purposes of our game that we're playing on the podcast.
Dragon, I felt more confident. It's like, I'm a dragon person.
Well, and also we had 5 episodes to cover different types of dragons.
This is one where it's like, I had to just do a lot of this research from scratch, and I'm sure there's fun stuff I missed, and I might have accidentally conflate some features with certain other versions of fairies, because there's a whole bunch of that where it's like Scottish fairies, Irish fairies,
right,
similar, slightly different terms sometimes.
Yep.
But we're going to be playing fast and loose with the concept.
And of course, on Spook-E, we're not trying to come up with any definitive answers or official versions of anything, just for fun.
Yep.
We're taking the tools of natural selection and biological evolution and seeing if we can Lego them together to make a creation that we want.
Absolutely.
And indeed, this is episode 2 of Tiny Monsters for this year, so after this, there will be yet more to come.
Stay tuned. But for now, fairies.
Woohoo!
Fairies, or fae, that could be F-A-Y, F-A-E, or F-E-Y, or fairy with F-A-E-R-I-E.
Yep.
Lots of different ways to say this, all generally referring to mythical creatures that are magical peoples, usually. Some form of that. Like I said, these are mostly associated with European lore, but this goes to Celtic, Slavic, Germanic, French, like various different origins, Irish origins. And I know there are some outside of Europe that may sync up with fairy lore. They also may refer to fairies as a different kind of people, like wee folk, the good people, people of peace, the fair folk. All those kinds of things also are typically considered synonymous terms with fairies.
Yes.
Etymologically, which I always just find fun to go through.
Yeah.
Fairy also has just been used as a term for the realm of the fairies.
That's true. The land of fairy.
Yes, exactly. That fairy might mean the land of the fae. And so it's also had various meanings. It's also just meant enchanted. A fairy knight was a mystical knight.
Right. Fairy dust.
Yes.
Or fairy magic.
Fairy queen was not actually the queen of the fairies, but a magical queen, per se. So the term has often just meant mythical, magical, mystical, people, place, person, some version of that. Our version of the word fairy likely came from the early modern English fairy, which meaning realm of the fays. Fairy likely came from the old French, and I don't know, that probably has a slightly different saying, but fairy again, but this time F-A-I-E-R-I-E.
Sure. Fairy with a French accent.
Yep. Which is likely derived from fae, which is Latin for the fates.
Okay. Sure. So, fate, magic, mystical, yeah. There's a theme there.
Also in Old French, romantic language, the Romance version is fae and fille was for a woman skilled in magic.
Oh, interesting.
So it has that kind of magical connection to it. Throughout history, they've been depicted in various ways. Sometimes it's been like a specific magical creature. Sometimes it's been a group of creatures. Maybe either like a population or like various kinds of creatures. All are fairies, just different flavor of fairy.
Right.
Terms like sprites also get lumped in as a very fairy-esque term. Often they had a more human appearance, magical powers, and fairly consistently were tricksters.
Yeah,
to some degree.
Mischievous, they're sneaky.
Yeah, it could be malicious, it could be benign, it might be to teach a lesson, but that they are tricky. That is a fairly, it's not completely consistent, but that is a very regular feature of most of the fairy stories I came across.
Yes.
They are tricky to deal with, and sometimes it's just tricky to deal with.
Yeah, like making a bargain,
yeah,
or making
or they
a deal.
Have weird rules that they are complicated and then sometimes purposely pranksters.
Yes.
So basically any version of the word tricky, there are fairies that embody that. Some of the other creatures that often fall under this umbrella of fairies are like goblins and gnomes. Were often considered by some to be fae, fairy folk. And so you had different species of fairies, so to speak, that were distinct from each other with very different behaviors and rules, but some consider them to be similar. As we've already said, there is not a singular origin to fairies. There's not like one famous story that is the oldest story we have.
Right.
It's likely that they all came from slightly different myths, and then through the horizontal genes transfer of story sharing, became similar versions of fairies.
Yeah, the idea of a magical little people seems to be an extremely common type of mythology in many different cultures that could have gotten added to each other and conflated and mistaken for each other over time.
It's like how it's pointed out very often that almost every major lake has a lake monster story somewhere in its history. Every major forest has forest creatures. That we tell very similar stories because we're all human and we're all living very similar lives regardless of how different we are.
Yes.
We are still the same species. Some have pointed that the Persian myth of Peris, or Peris, I don't know, is P-E-R-I-S, were angelic beings, fair, beautiful, magical, sometimes with wings, that might be one of the oldest roots of some of these mythos.
Yeah.
And that these could have been brought over from trade or travelers. And as might be expected, that means that the description of what fairies were like is as varied as the origins and stories and types. There is not a singular form of fairy, and the classic one that we tend to think of nowadays, of the small sprite with insect wings and a little ballerina outfit, is not what most fairies look like throughout history.
Right.
That is a much more recent rendition, but throughout history, they've looked just like people, sometimes small people. So sometimes it was described that they were smaller. Oftentimes, though, it was just that they could be smaller. They could choose to take the form of a smaller person or be small and get bigger to intimidate. So oftentimes the small form wasn't their form. It was the form they were in while you were talking to them. One of the common ones that will come up is that they very often have green eyes.
Oh, yeah.
Green eyes is a very common descriptor, not for all fairies, but it shows up a lot. There are winged fairies, but those became much more popular as we got to more recent times, specifically in Victorian times.
Okay.
They became very common in artwork of fairies then. And so lots of old artwork depicting them that ways, but most old stories do not describe them with wings. And then the modern version of fairy really came in during that Victorian area with the association of fairy tales. That they became a child-like creature, a thing for children, smaller, cuter, more, appealing and cute. And then since then, that has become the more common idea of what a fairy is when we think of a fairy. There's no way to sum up the various origins of fairies, but there are some different ideas across these various peoples and tellings and cultures that had fairy stories of what fairies were. For different people, they considered fairies to be a different thing in the world. Sometimes this was just like a different name. In many cases, stories of elves were basically synonymous with fairies. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of situations where you can find almost identical stories or descriptions or tales, just one's using fairy, one's using elves. So in many cases, there's probably a lot of overlap between elves and fairies in that regard. Some considered fairies to be demoted angels.
Okay.
And that's where their mythical abilities came from. That this idea that I saw two different versions. One was that during a revolt in heaven, God shut the gates. All angels in the gates remained angels. All those in hell became demons, and those in between became fairies.
Interesting.
There was also a version that was similar, where it was angels not godly enough to remain angels, but not evil enough to become demons, became fairies. Neutral angels with a little too much naughtiness and
chaotic neutral.
Yeah. So they were not quite able to go either way. There are also versions that depict fairies as demons.
Sure.
These are often this version of the telling often is associated more with the rise of Christianity, unsurprisingly.
Sure.
Because that's where that concept is most popular. And during the 17th century, it was seen a lot of fairy stories becoming more colored with demonic representation. Things like hobgoblins, which classically were benign and harmless house creatures, became evil and more demonic creatures. And dealing with fairies became very synonymous with like dealing with witchcraft and stuff, treated the same way. So in certain times, the fact that they were mythical and supernatural fell them into the category of other evil magics. Some have considered, and I think this is more of a like potentially some of the origins of the stories, as demoted pagan deities, that these were gods of these lands, but then as time went on, or as cultures mixed, or as other religions came in, those beings kept being regarded and worshipped, but got kind of demoted into being fairies instead of rival gods or gods in and of themselves.
Yeah.
So they might have been past worshipped things. Many stories also consider fairies to be the spirits of the dead, and that there's actually a lot of parallels between ghost stories and fairy stories. It's deemed dangerous to eat fairy food and food in Hades. Fairies are often depicted living underground, and in Irish versions, the origin for their term of the fairies is in regards to ancient burial mounds. And so there's a lot of things that seem to be very similar between fairies and dead with unfinished business.
Yeah.
One story even recounted a man caught by fairies that when he looked at them steadily, he would see the face of a dead neighbor. So they might be kind of ghosts.
Yeah.
Some consider them to be their own group of life, elementals effectively. That there's humans, there's demons, there's angels, and there's fairies.
Right. Like the nature folk, the magic folk.
Yeah, they are, many consider them elementals, that they represented one of the fundamental elements, usually referring to like earth, air, water, fire.
Sure.
And many of them considering them to be elementals of air. That they are a fundamental race, one of the groups of sentient life on our planet.
Yeah, they're a phenomenon.
Yes. And some have suggested, this is an old theory and hypothesis for where the stories of fairies came from, that they might be the memories of ancient people.
Okay. Sort of kind of that spirit of the dead sort of vibe.
Kind of, but more that at some point your culture interacted with a previous group of people that now have been displaced or wiped out from here. And these stories you're telling are cultural memory from the time that there was another group.
Gotcha.
This is no longer heavily held, but you will see it come up.
Sure.
It's a tribute to the idea of fairies often dislike iron, and that this might be in association with iron weapons pushing out of people who do not yet have iron weaponry.
Sure. The idea that you're telling stories about, we talked to fairies, and deep back in your culture, what it was is there were other people living here,
exactly,
and you talked to them. But as you said, not necessarily a widely held.
Yeah, most folklorists today don't seem to lean on this one.
Okay,
but it evidently had some popularity for a time with the idea that them wearing green and stuff being that they were actually still blending in with the environment with their clothing. And I'm sure there are other potential explanations for what fairies have been considered to be, either in their stories or by historians and folklorists. Another thing that comes up is classifications of fairies.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very interesting one because different cultures will have different classifications for their fairies, but also different folklorists, different historians have made their own classification systems based on different things. And so this is not a consistent thing. This is kind of my wyvern soapbox from the dragon.
Yes.
There's a whole bunch of classic groups of fairies that are not always agreed upon by everyone. So as fun as it is to group things, don't go nitpicking someone else because they said a fairy is in a wrong group, because that group may or may not exist if you get to talk to someone else. One of the most common ones that comes up is trooping and solitary fairies.
Okay.
Trooping fairies live in societies, in communities. They're typically more social. Singing and dancing is often associated with them, and may or may not be friendly to humans. Solitary fairies, as the name suggests, the opposite, tend to live on their own, and also considered usually to be more harmful, more likely to be harmful.
Okay.
That they are antisocial and therefore also not as friendly to be around. Things like leprechauns and banshees were often grouped in this category of those kind of, if you run across these, you might be in trouble. One person also, Catherine Mary Briggs, said that there might need to be a third category of domestic fairies for house fairies. Your brownies and like the cobbler fairy idea of fairies who do tasks in human homes.
Yeah.
This grouping of fairies typically also is including more groups, dwarves and gnomes and those kinds of other mythical beings. Elves and stuff in Germanic folklore fall into this kind of category. But the most famous two groupings that come up are the Seelie and Unseelie courts.
Right.
These are by far the most famous groupings of fairies. This is specifically Scottish folklore. Mm-hmm. So this is what I was saying. Even though this is the most famous, it's not a worldwide thing. Not everyone's fairies are grouped into the Seelie and Unseelie. It's just become the popular canon by us in the modern age.
Sure. And it's what D&D uses.
Exactly. In Scottish folklore, fairies are grouped into these two courts. And they separate out kind of similarly to trooping and solitary. The Seelie court are more beneficent, still can be dangerous if crossed, but are usually have to be wronged to be dangerous. They often are more likely to seek help from humans, aid from a person. Still would perform pranks, but were usually harmless pranks just for their own entertainment. And noted for returning human kindness with a boon of some sort. The Unseelie court are dark fairies. Mm-hmm. These are aggressive. No offense was needed for them to punish a human. It was often noted that they would even lure people in for the chance to have fun with them. They also were often considered to be allied with witches and dark magic users. There are other groupings that mostly kind of fall out into similar trends. There's Germanic ones that have light and dark elves. French fairies also have been grouped into good and evil. Irish ones also had a gentle and musical group and a evil group allied with the devil. So that concept of evil and good fairies is pretty consistent. Even the trooping and solitary were, here's the ones that are more likely to be friendly, here's the ones that are more likely to be, like, that idea that there are good and bad fairies is a pretty common thing that shows up a whole bunch. There have also been attempts to classify them into, like, elemental groups of different types of fairy, being earth, water, air groups. Some have also grouped them into, like, by the types of fairies. Welsh fairies were grouped into 5 types that include, one was elves, the other one was house spirits and similar type beings. Another one was spirits of the mines, lake maidens, and then mountain spirits were all their different groups. So theirs was more of a phylogenetic grouping, and others have done this as well. All of this is super fun. I found it noted basically in every source I looked at that talked about grouping fairies that a lot of folklorists caution against doing this too much. Because A, they aren't consistent stories. So trying to find consistent groups won't work.
Right.
B, the grouping that a modern day historian decides to put on these stories probably isn't going to perfectly match the interpretation of these beings from the people who originally told the stories.
Right.
And one even noted that at times where they talked to the people who were perpetuating the vocal tradition, the oral tradition of these stories, that their attempts to classify it were met with frustration.
Sure.
That when they talked to people to get these stories and then talked about the classification, they'd be like, no, what? That doesn't fit at all with what I'm saying. So these classifications may not actually reflect the old beliefs of these fairies. They are an attempt by academics today to organize these mythical beings. Just to take it a bit with a grain of salt. The Seelie and Unseelie is definitely the most famous and seems like has the most historical structure to it. But there's probably some versions of that do not gel with the actual history. As far as them being pranksters, their behavior, this ranged from harmless things like tying knots in people's hair and stealing small items, leading travelers astray, which is kind of on the bridge between harmless and it depends on what happens to that traveler after they get lost.
Yep.
There are also more dangerous things that were attributed to fairy quote-unquote pranks. Any form of sudden death in the past often could be attributed. Just unexplained death. We don't know. They didn't seem sick. We don't know what was wrong with them. They just died one day. Maybe fairies did it to them.
Yeah.
That when you couldn't explain
similar to what we talked about in the last episode with gremlins.
Yes.
An unexplained phenomenon. These mysterious little creatures did it.
Absolutely. Consumption of tuberculosis was often associated in lots of cultures to be a blight set upon you by the fairies.
Yeah.
And in some versions it was blamed on that they would force young men and women to dance at their revels every night until they died from exhaustion. Probably one of the most famous versions of this unexplained condition being blamed on fairies are changelings. Infants born sick or with some sort of birth defect or abnormality, just something that was not expected or considered normal by those people at that time, would often be blamed on the infant having been switched out with a changeling. And that's why the changeling had taken the shape of the baby, but hadn't done it quite right, and things were a little bit off. And that would classically be blamed for anything that wasn't in line with what they were used to for a baby, would be blamed on changelings having stolen away the baby. This led to tons of myths also about how to protect oneself from fairies.
Yes, very famously.
Yes, this is probably one of the most common things that fairy stories deal with is how to deal with fairies, either socially, what you say or do, but also how you can protect oneself. By far the most common one is iron.
Yep. Fairies don't like iron.
Often it will be specified as cold forged iron. I've seen that very often, cold iron. And there's multiple ways you can forge metal, and one of them is not heating up, just hitting it with a hammer. That's cold forge, to my knowledge. And if there's nuance to that, please let me know. But if you don't heat it up, it's just cold forging. You can just force metal to take shape by hitting it really hard. Cold forged iron is bad for fairies. I didn't see it specify what it does, but they don't like it.
They just don't like it.
in most myths nowadays, we represent it as like burning them.
Right.
Like if they grab something iron, they burn or it boils their skin. But in the past, they don't like it. It wards them off. It acts like garlic for a vampire. Mm-hmm. They don't like iron. There's also things like rowan trees and various herbs that will be considered to be warding off, herbal medicinal remedies, so to speak. There are also some that seem to kind of go both ways. 4-leaf clovers sometimes could be effective in certain stories. Some were weird and random, wearing your clothes inside out. That sometimes came up. Bread, evidently, is also one of the most common ones in stories. It's not famous nowadays, but it evidently is one of the most common to show up, that bread is a deterrent or a way to appease fairies.
Interesting.
This would go from, it depended on which version you saw, whether it was fresh bread, stale bread, hardtack, but some form of bread, maybe specifically a slice of homemade bread. Some would say that you need to have it in your pocket, before you go out and travel in areas where fairies might be hanging about. Infants would often be swaddled with a piece of bread to protect them from being taken. And it's thought that both for bread and potentially for iron, that these are representations of society, of modern society. Baking bread takes an oven, it takes yeast, it takes harvest grain, all of which are things of more modernized society. Forging iron is extremely, that's the Metal Age. Metallurgy is extremely characteristic of modern human society. And it's thought that the association might be that these people of the forest and hills are put off by our technology,
right?
Our modernization. Some things were kind of, it seemingly double-edged on the fact, like bells were often described as warding off, but then also there's lots of stories of like Fairy Queen having bells on their carriage and stuff, which might be that bells ward off evil fairies, and good fairies also use them to ward off evil fairies. There's also some interesting ones like knowing their names has often been considered a way to gain power over or safety from a fairy. And sometimes that was being able to get a boon from them, or you got powers just by knowing their name. And then probably the simplest way to save yourself from fairies is just not to offend them in the first place.
Yes.
So there were
stay on their good side.
Lots of rules about what not to do to offend the fairies. This could be specific for certain fairies like brownies, which are house fairies that do chores. In some versions, they were offended by being given a piece of clothing, or that it was that if they were given cheap clothing, that they would be offended by the quality of the clothing and they'd leave. Certain areas were considered places common for fairies, burial mounds, certain forests. So just don't go there if you don't want any trouble. Just stay out of that area. Sometimes there are stories of like people running into trouble trying not to offend a fairy. I found one that was very fun. Story of a farmer who started noticing that fairies were threshing their corn for them, gathering their corn. But then after he stopped growing corn kept showing up, and realized the fairies were stealing from his neighbors. And now had to deal with, do I offend my neighbors by allowing the fairies to continue, or do I reject their gift and potentially offend the fairies?
Yes.
So there's a bunch of their stories are about ways to stay on the right side of fairies, either by protecting yourself or not offending them, and just maintaining that relationship in a healthy way. The last things I want to talk about really quick in regards to fairies are fairy rings, which is a real world thing that we've named after fairies and have an association with fairies. Fairy rings, and there's two different kinds that I'll go over as quickly as I can. One is the one that most of us here in the US know, which are rings of mushrooms, growing usually in fields and forests. A ring of mushrooms around a patch of grass. Sometimes that grass will be faded, and sometimes it will be growing especially tall. It depends on the kind of mushrooms, but this ring of mushrooms are often called fairy circles, sometimes also called elf circles or elf rings or pixie rings. Basically what happens here is that a fungus body starts growing in an area, and as it uses up nutrients, it grows outward, and when it's time for it to fruit and put out the mushrooms, it puts it out around the edge of the mushroom, the fungi body. And as it continues to grow, the ring gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it uses up the nutrients in the middle of the ring. This area is often called the necrotic zone because as they use up nutrients and as they eat off of plant material, the plants in there, the grass will often die. There are some fungi, though, that form rings that produce hormones that actually boost the growth of grass. So you'll see especially lush grass in those areas. There are two main types of fairy ring fungus. One's in the woods that are called tethered because they often are formed by mycorrhizal fungi in symbiosis with plants around them. The other are meadow fairy rings, which are called free because they are not symbiotic. They are just free fungus growing in the ground. They also can form other shapes. It's not always rings. They can form arches and double arcs and sickle-shaped art, like all sorts of different shapes. It's not always a ring, but that's the most famous one. Throughout folklore, these rings have been associated with fairies, as the name suggests, and as a very dangerous place. Because if you enter a fairy ring, you are entering into a situation with fairies. It's not always been fairies that it's been associated with. It's been associated with witches, like them casting a spell in an area causes one of these rings, or use of dark magic. One Dutch superstition was that it's where the devil churns his milk, caused one of these spots. But often some sort of evil magic causes these rings. In many of the legends, if a mortal enters the ring, they can become trapped, either forced to dance with the fairies in the ring or trapped in the fairy world. Sometimes it was said that fairies would actively lure people into the fairy rings. In many of these stories, getting out of the fairy ring is difficult and sometimes needs help from the outside, that you cannot escape a fairy ring on your own. Someone has to pull you out. And also quite frequently in these stories, the person is not safe after they get out. Sometimes it's that years or months have passed while they thought they were only in there for hours. Often, many of them meet horrible ends, that they've been affected. The first bite of normal food they eat causes them to, like, crumble to dust. Or the first time they touch iron, like that they are now permanently afflicted by the magic of the fairies and can no longer function in the human world.
Yeah. A curse. They've acquired a curse upon them.
Exactly. Very similar to the don't eat fairy food and don't eat the food in Hades. That if you partake in that world, you can never fully come back.
Yes.
There's also fairy circles, which are grass circles found in arid areas. So certain desert areas will have these rings of grass that grow with nothing growing in the middle. And these are often called fairy circles.
Like the reverse of a crop circle?
Yeah, exactly. These can range from 2 to 12 meters across, so they can get huge. They're found in arid grasslands in the Namib Desert in western parts of southern Africa and areas of Western Australia. They also have a life cycle that they seem to go through as they widen that can be up to 30 or 60 years for a single ring to go through its life cycle, often first becoming notable around 2 meters, 6 feet wide-ish, and then peaking around that 12 meters, that almost 40 feet wide. And then they die when stuff finally invades the intersection and it stops being a ring. These have often also been associated with potentially supernatural things. Not fairies, because they aren't in the countries we've been talking about, but they have been considered to be maybe like the footsteps of gods.
Sure.
Or like a dragon causing them, sleeping under the ground and its breath poisoning the area that's dead in the middle. The really interesting thing is that we don't know why they happen. We actually do not understand, still to this day, do not fully understand why they grow that way. There have been multiple suggestions. Sand termites have been suggested because they've been found in most of the fairy circles that have been studied. And so them eating on the roots of the grass might kill it in a certain area. The ring causes water to gather there, which then feeds the grass on the outside. So it might be that it's this, they eat, as they're eating the grass on the inside, it's helping the grass on the outside grow so it stays healthy despite the termites. It could just be vegetation patterns that, because it gathers water, this just happens to be a way a lot of plants start growing because it's the best way for them to gather water in an arid place. It could be competition with the plants, that the plants competing with each other ends up causing these dead areas and this outer ring of at the front line of the competition, so to speak. various studies have come out supporting different ones of these. Some have criticized the termites. The most recent one I found was a 2022 study that tested for termites and if it's self-organization by the plants, and found that there isn't support for termites causing these rings. But we don't actually know why they do this. So it is mysterious even today. And that's about all I came across for fairies. Like I said, I'm sure there's tons more that would be fun for us to go over, but we can only go over so much. And so with the background out of the way, we can start moving toward our spookulative evolution.
Yeah, and evolving fairies.
Yeah, but before that, big old magic disclaimer.
Yeah, that's important.
These are some of the most magical creatures we've ever discussed.
They're defined by magic.
Their name means magical in many of the old definitions.
Yes.
So we will not be able to do most of the things that fairies are famous for doing. We're also going to have to single it down to
absolutely
a form of fairy. Our fairies aren't going to be demoted angels, so to speak.
No, probably not.
So
they're not going to have magic.
We can only evolve the things that are biologically possible, so we have to skip over the magic part. But with that being said, how do we evolve a fairy? I assume we probably are going to want to do the small Tinkerbell-esque fairies.
That's what I've been thinking.
We're doing tiny monsters as our theme.
Sure.
That's more interesting to evolve than just a human.
It's just a person. It's just a person playing tricks.
Yep, or a short person is what most of these others would fall into. So the tiny winged fairies, which can still do all the other stuff if we want.
Yeah. So normally in the discussion of spooky, I sit here and I'm listening to everything and I'm going, all right, what kind of creatures and how might we evolve? And usually I have an idea and then I'll have a different idea and I'll come up with some thoughts. I had a thought early on and then everything you said, I went, yeah, I was right that first time. So not to just jump to like the end of it, but like they're insects.
Yeah. Yep.
They're insects. So the first reason that I think insects is because of the wings.
Yes.
Right? They're small. They've got those wings. There is only one group of organisms on the planet that has classic fairy wings. And if we want them to have wings that aren't classic fairy wings, they either need to... Their arms have to be wings. Because every other winged thing, the arms are wings. Or we have to do what we did with dragons and come up with an independent evolution of wings.
Yes.
And we did that last year. Yeah, that's old hat.
You only get one of those.
But if we're bugs, then we get the wings are already there. Small size already fits. The sort of social gathering of things. That pest status of them interfering with stuff. I think the insect angle is a very fun angle. You also mentioned that that was the first moment where I went, nah, I was right. When you said they have green eyes.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, they're just big old green bug eyes.
Yes, yep.
Like dragonfly eyes.
Well, and I also like it along the lines of like the prankster stuff, because I'm thinking of like ants, where it's like ants aren't playing pranks on us, but it feels like that sometimes when you like open your cupboard and there's just suddenly ants in there. And it's like, how did you get in here? I did not see a single ant in my entire kitchen. It's like, oh yeah, we drilled a hole in the back of your cupboard.
And now we're stealing your stuff.
Yeah, and we're just taking your stuff.
And ruining your things.
Goodbye, thank you.
See ya.
And it's got that, the whole like Looney Tunes picnic ant
cartoon
exactly. Of
just carrying your stuff away.
Just uncaring to the inconvenience it's causing us, just taking our stuff.
I also had the thought of it because one of the biggest issues with insects is that insects are not human shaped.
No.
That is getting from, how do we get an insect? But the first example that came to my mind were praying mantises.
Yes, absolutely.
Who have a bit more of an upright posture, who have a mobile head with big eyes, and who have much more mobile, who have hands, who have arms.
Absolutely.
That they can sort of maneuver around.
And like, you're tiny. So if I see you at a distance, it'd be very easy for my story to be like, oh, it looked like a lot of little people running around.
Yes. Well, and I also like the praying mantis angle because they're tiny, but they're not that tiny. that's like, yeah, I saw a 6-inch person.
Yes.
A 6-inch tall person flying around. So, yeah, that makes sense. That's because a praying mantis is a large insect.
Yeah. So you could have absolutely these few inch tall people that you can get a glimpse moving around your yard.
The other part that, I don't want to just jump to the, like, this is the whole thing that I think it is. And, maybe there's a particular reason why this specific topic is in my brain these days. But fungus farming insects was in my... Even before we talked about the fairy rings. Even before we got to fairy rings, fungus farming insects, because and one of the first things that made me think of it is that bread...
Yeah.
They like bread.
Yeah.
Like they're warded off by bread. Well, yeah, because they want to collect it. Because it's got, like, mold and stuff in it, and they're collecting it to fuel, like, as food for their fungus garden. But also, the other thing that I really liked about this angle is that so many of the curses that you were discussing sound like diseases.
Yes.
Like a communicable, like a disease that was transmitted to you by contact with this bug and perhaps its symbiotic pathogens. That, yeah, you got, because you were like, because you said that some people seem to get sick or they eat food and they can't handle it, and or they were forced to dance until they ran out of bread. It's like, all of those are diseases. Like, everything you just said, there's a disease that we can correlate to that.
Well, especially if it's like, yeah, you're allergic to their bite. Like, they don't even need to be stinging insects. Like, there's a whole bunch of people that you can be bitten by an ant, and if you're allergic to them, they don't have to sting you. The fluids and proteins in their saliva can cause severe allergic reactions. And it could just be that, yeah, for whatever reason, like a third of, every fourth person tends to, like poison ivy, where poison ivy is allergic reaction. I don't think I'm allergic to poison ivy because I've never gotten it, and I've gone camping so much as a kid. You have to be allergic to poison ivy to get poison ivy. But just a bunch of people, it is extremely, like half the population or whatever, like every other person's allergic to poison ivy because it's a very common allergy. It could be one of those things where it's like, not everyone gets affected by fairies.
Yeah.
But if you're vulnerable to them, they'll ruin your day and they might kill you.
Yes. That also can easily provide the scenario of fairies aren't always harmful.
Yes.
If you do the right thing.
Yeah.
I encountered fairies and I was nice and polite and I was fine. You must have done something wrong. Well, which then can absolutely lead to the things like, all right, I don't know, I was carrying a metal pot. Is that what it was? Like, is that why I got cursed? Is because I was doing this thing?
Well, it fits really well with, like, the herbs. Like, that's a legitimate... There's insect repelling herbs that you can put, like, rub yourself with the oil from this plant and they should leave you alone. And yeah, that absolutely works every time because they hate the smell of it or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, this is why they are in the monstery section, because fairies can be scary and creepy.
Yes, this is the monster.
This is why
we're doing monster fairies.
Got kicked out of QD because so many of their stories were like, oh yeah, and then you die.
Wait till you see what took fairies spot in QD. You mentioned that there's the correlation with the underworld and that they are often subterranean.
Yep.
They're often considered to be living underground, which fits with a lot of insect lifestyles.
They often live in mounds.
They live in mounds, which we have insects that live in mounds, including fungus farming insects that live in mounds. Termites make mounds and farm fungi in there.
And like there are termites, like even though the termites have, thus the research has shown, not the cause of the arid fairy rings, they are still found in almost every... So they are still associated with them.
Right.
Every fairy ring studied for the sand termites found sand termites in them.
Right.
So they are living in those circles, even if they're not causing those circles.
And I don't know of any circumstances where mushroom rings are associated with fungus growing insects. But you could certainly imagine a scenario where that's where their little mound underground is. And the fungus is growing outward and producing these fruiting bodies.
Yeah.
And they don't have to be, there's levels of how much farming you're actually doing. It could be that they are associated with the fungus. The fungus hitches a ride on them, or they happen to create conditions that are good for the fungus to thrive.
That's what the thought was with the desert termites, is that they aren't purposely create, just their colony causes the plants to grow this way.
Right.
It could also be one of those where they find fairy circles of fungi and
and then they're feeding on it or something.
They feed on that for while it's doing its thing, and they nurture it, but they are also feeding off of it, and so they promote these things, but they aren't creating them per se. This also fits perfectly into why you shouldn't go in a fairy ring. Yeah,
you're going to get infected.
You're going to get swarmed, like they're going to get attacked. They're going to bite you and they're going to defend their home. Yes.
That's where they've built their little mound and they're defending it.
Yes. And I love the idea that, like, because there's tons of different kinds of fairies, so there could be different species of this colonial fairy. And that could lead to some of them, it's like, these bite, their saliva it just causes, their proteins cause lots of allergic reactions to a lot of people. These others carry a mite that causes people to have a fever and whatnot.
Right.
These other ones...
You get tuberculosis from this thing.
Other one has a bacteria that causes delirium.
Yes.
And
dancing plague.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you could have different ones, and it's like, don't mess with the mounds because they'll do this to you. Don't go into the fairy rings because they'll do this to you.
Yes.
Different ones cause different things.
And also, if we're invoking fungi... So the reason that I brought up fungi in the first place is because you've got the fairy rings connection, but also the idea that they're collecting specific types of foods, like leafcutter ants.
Yes,
Leafcutter ants collect leaves to then feed to their fungal gardens. Leafcutter ants don't eat leaves.
Nope.
They eat fungus. They use the leaves to grow the fungus.
Yes.
So the idea that I liked the idea that they are collecting like bread or whatever to further the development of fungi or whatever else in their little area. And if we are linking these fairy insects to fungi give us all sorts of diseases and infections and hallucinations.
Yep.
Like that could absolutely be, once our fairies are dealing with hallucinogenic substances, all the lore falls into place.
Oh, and that's why you shouldn't eat fairy food.
Don't eat fairy food.
If you eat fairy food, you'll not be good.
You won't be good.
Oh, I like that a lot.
Because it's got all their stuff.
Yeah.
Don't eat the fungus that they're growing.
Yep.
That's all their food. It's just fungi.
Yeah.
It's just fungal bodies.
Yep.
You're just like, well, they gave me this fig, and I tried it, and then I was throwing up for days. Like, don't eat fairy food.
Nope.
That was a bad idea.
That was terrible. I like that very much.
I also had the thought of, if these are insects with an association with fungi, a lot of fungus-associated insects are associated with wood and plants, right? Beetles that farm fungi do it in hollows in trees. Termites obviously are wood associated. And I wondered if is there some sort of angle there for like, that's why iron keeps them away, because if your home is more iron, there's less wood, and so there's less places for them to sort of find little areas to nestle and start a colony or something. I don't know that there's actually
I wonder if there could be
a thread there.
Yeah, I wonder if it could be something with not like, it's not your metal pan, but like rust and metal filings from metal work and stuff.
Yeah.
And just that like rust could potentially be one of those of like what's like powdered sugar is a great tool against a lot of ectoparasites like mites and stuff, because it clogs up the holes in their cuticle.
Okay. Sure.
And stuff like it's not poisonous to them, but it's so fine that when they get covered in it, they suffocate because it plugs up their breathing holes. If I remember right, if I have the wrong insect or the wrong exact thing it's doing, please correct me, people of the internet. But there's things like that where it's like, this stuff is bad for you just because of the way it interacts with your body.
Yeah.
So like rust could be...
They're allergic to nickel.
Yeah. Yep. Oh man, I'm a fairy then. So something like that could fit there. Also, you mentioning plant material. the things talking about charms talked about rowan trees, but in others, it was also considered that rowan trees were sacred to fairies.
And some of them might live in those rowan trees.
That's why, or that's what they're harvesting from rowan trees. And so there might be specific trees and herbs that's like, if you keep these around, they'll leave you alone.
Yes. Yeah. That's where they're hanging out.
They won't come into your house because you've given them what they need.
The other thought that I had a while back is if we're going with some sort of colony forming insects, which I like because it means that there's a bunch of them.
Yep.
You get that idea that they're social. If they're farming fungi or something similar, that those are often colonies of insects.
Yes.
But also, you mentioned that most of them historically don't have wings.
Yep.
So you could have it be like ants and termites, where the queens have wings.
Yes.
Like the reproductive individuals have wings, and they fly off and go start a new one. But the workers don't have wings.
Yes.
They're just crawling around doing on the ground stuff.
I like that a lot.
So you could have multiple forms of them.
It also fits nicely with the grouping of the trooping and the solitary. Like a lot of eusocial insects, wasps and ants and stuff, there are most bees are solitary. They're not eusocial. They don't form hives. They live by themselves. And there's a bunch of ants. No ants are solitary, but there's a bunch of ants that hunt solitarily. Mm-hmm. They don't use the massive numbers like bullet ants and bulldog ants. And I think there's another one that I'm forgetting that are often bigger and have more beefy bites. The bullet ant has one of the most painful stings of any animal on our planet. And like the cow killer bee, which is the velvet ant, which is a wingless bee that travels off by itself, also has a very painful sting. The solitary ones being the nastier ones to deal with. Solitary ones don't have the safety of the group, so they often have to be a bit more aggressive to fend themselves off. So you could have solitary members of this kind of animal that is like, if you see just one on its own, leave it alone, because
yes, that's gonna get you.
They are not scared to fight back, no matter how big you are. You're gonna get got.
So this also raises the question of what type of insect are we dealing with?
Yes, because we've mentioned a few.
I like the praying mantis angle that we talked about earlier because they've got that more upright shape.
Yes.
I do like the idea of it is a more upright body because that helps them to carry things that they have to carry back to the nest. That helping them to, a praying mantis kind of shaped insect that just takes a piece of bread with its little hands and then goes off to bring it back home.
Very fairy looking.
Very fairy-like. Praying mantises also have the big eyes and the mobile head, which looks a little more like a tiny human. Mm-hmm. They're also big.
Yes.
Yeah, we've talked about ants and termites a lot because those are a good reference. Mm-hmm. But ants and termites are tiny.
Yeah.
Like I don't know that you see an ant and go, a tiny human. I think you see an ant and you go, a speck.
Like, I think the bullet ant, which is one of the larger species today, is like 2 inches long.
Right.
Which is, that's an ant. Like,
absolutely.
If I saw that crawling across my desk, I would, but no, that is not a tiny person.
So I think this is either an ant or termite that is a species that has evolved gigantic size, that they're just extremely big.
Like, and they could still be colonial, but it's like, maybe only a colony of 20.
Right.
It's not hundreds.
Relatively small. Also, it could very well be that only the big ones are the ones going out into the world. Like,
absolutely.
The workers or the soldiers are going out, and they're the ones who are either defending by biting and stinging or collecting resources.
Oh, man. If it is something like that where it's like, the ones you see are the bigger ones, maintaining the inside of the nest are a bunch of teeny, teeny, tiny ones, then that also has the feeling like, if you step into the fairy circle, you're going to be plagued. And this is before we have microscopes, so and magnifying glasses. So it's very easy that you might not notice you're covered in tiny insects.
I do like that. I was going to say it could either be a gigantic ant or colonial mantids or something in that It's either ants that have evolved to be highly convergent with mantises, or mantises that have evolved to be highly convergent with ants.
Yep.
And heck, there's so many fairies, we could do both if we want.
Absolutely.
I will say I like the mantises because of the mobile heads and the big eyes.
They've got a lot going for them physically. And it's kind of one of those where I feel like as much against as for, with like, mantids are not social. You know, they don't have social behavior. They don't take care of their young and everything. So it would be a lot of socialness for them to evolve. Mm-hmm. But eusociality has also evolved in bunches of different groups of insects.
Absolutely.
So like a bunch of which are traditionally not super social.
Yes. Also, fungus farming in insects has evolved like 9 times.
So it's like the idea that a lineage of mantids could evolve that is not unfeasible at all. It's probably not the most likely group that we would see do that.
Sure.
If you were betting, if
Absolutely.
I said bet on which insect will do it next.
It's beetles.
Yeah.
It's another group of beetles.
I wouldn't bet on mantis. I bet on beetles. But there's no reason it should be impossible for them to become eusocial.
And our fairies are fungus farming colonial mantids is awesome.
Yeah,
that's
so cool.
a super cool thought.
And
I
just
really like that idea.
The idea of this little person,
just a little with like a truncated abdomen, so that they're a little more upright. I do like that idea that upright posture is there because they are doing more manipulating of their surroundings.
Well, and mantids also are more eyesight driven than a lot of other insects.
Yeah.
So that upright thing, especially if you're living in a group, those can be scouts.
That's true.
You could have this very meerkat standing on the things around the nest and looking around. Mm-hmm. So you have these fairy guards.
Mantises don't, to my knowledge, sting. But they'll certainly bite.
Oh, yeah.
Their arms could certainly be used as weapons. And we could even, if we wanted to take it an extra step further, there are insects that have symbiotic relationships with microbes where the microbes are used to infect things.
Yes, absolutely.
But again, fungus farming insects, certain species have bacteria that grow on their body, and those bacteria are deadly to invasive fungi in the garden.
Yeah, they have antifungal bacterial coating.
Yes, they have pesticides.
Yes.
They have pesticides on them. So it could, if we wanted to go a step further, you could say that these mantis fairies have on their arms or on their mouth parts these fungal symbionts who cause extra pain or disease to whatever foe they're warding off.
Oh, and that's such a perfect one because that could be purposely defensive in that way, or it could also be like, yeah, they're just covered in the spores of their fungus, and if they scratch you, turns out when this fungus gets into a human bloodstream, it becomes an infection.
Yes, and now you're infected with this fungus.
Yeah, because there's tons of diseases that we get that it's like, if it's in your lungs, you're fine. If it gets into your, intestines, it becomes potentially deadly.
Yes. Ooh, also, it is worth noting that there are pathogens that need to go through multiple hosts for their life cycle. So it could also be that these are fungi whose life cycle is through the mantises and humans.
Yeah.
Which requires the insect fairies to be in close association with where people are.
And I like that because that's a complex lifestyle.
Yeah.
And if anyone's should be complex, our fairies should be overly complicated.
Now, if we're getting very nitty gritty, the no, I know you could still make it make sense. Mm-hmm. That they're producing spores. I'm trying to think of the details of how the fungus works.
Yeah.
That it requires both a garden that is being managed by the bugs and to go through another organism, which is probably more thinking into it than I actually need to do.
I mean, I could definitely see that because not all fungus farming insects is the fungus unique to there are ones that you can find this fungus wild, but very often you'll find it in these colonies.
Right.
So it could be one of those where it's like, to promote the spread of this fungus, we do this. And then, we send out scouts who gather up fungal samples and bring it back to the garden.
Yes.
To keep our garden healthy.
It could also be a difference between the sexual reproductive mode of the fungus and the asexual
There
reproductive
you go.
mode.
Yeah.
Friends, I have so much information in my brain about fungi. If you want to know why I inexplicably know so much about fungus farming, check out episode 202, which is coming out at almost the exact same time that this episode is coming out.
Yep.
I'm very intentionally being like, well, I have more to say about fungus farming stuff, but I want to save some stuff for people to learn when I talk about it in that episode.
Yep.
But suffice it to say, not all fungus farming animals are like dedicated agricultural specialists. Sometimes it is more of a passive thing. I love the idea that our fairies are fungus mantises.
Yes.
The little mushroom mantises.
Absolutely. Oh, it's good.
And then you can get a diversity of them, that a diversity of effects that they cause when you get bitten by them, a diversity of what habitats they live in, because this is a subfamily of mantids that has, much like, fungus farming ants are one group of ants. That is not something that has happened multiple times in ants. Same thing with termites.
Yes.
One group that became super successful and diversified into a bunch of different forms and habitats.
Because it's evidently a great way to survive.
Great strategy. Yeah, we've got these fungus farming mantises that diversified and spread to a bunch of different places, giving rise to different versions of this fairy myth.
Yeah, well, and I like this image as well, because I can picture, because I've had interactions with insects where, like, not all insects are uber wary of people. And my favorite example ever was a parasitoid wasp that was carrying a caterpillar. We were outside during one of my labs for a biology class in college, saw it, and professor noted it and got everyone's attention to watch this carry this caterpillar, and then it got spooked by one of us by accident. And it dropped the caterpillar, and we were like, oh, and then one of us picked it up to look at the caterpillar and talk about it, and then the wasp came back, landed on their hand, grabbed the caterpillar, and continued on. So I can just picture these moments of, like, yeah, if you know how to handle your yard and handle yourself, that you could just have people that it's like, oh yeah, here, I leave these out for the fairies. I have a fairy feeder that I leave out, and if you don't make any sudden movements, you can just hand it to them, and they'll take it and flutter on back. And just, you could have this very seemingly human social interaction with them.
Absolutely.
Very much like keeping bees, where it's like, yeah, there's tons of beekeepers like, yeah, I don't use smoke. I know how to conduct myself so that these bees don't freak out. They also are often stingless bees, which helps.
Yep. You could also, I can easily see, especially again, if humans are an important resource for supplies for the bugs, or for the parasites that they're picking up. If these insects are commonly living in and around where people are, you could easily see it being, these fairies are stealing my food, or these fairies are cleaning up the crumbs.
Yes.
Like, my kitchen was messy, but then I invited these fairies in, and now all the crumbs are gone, because they're taking all the little bits of food that are left behind.
You just open the window for a little bit, then let the house fairies clean up your house for you. Oh man, and they could also have, like, more kind of spatulate appendages, because they're gathering the fungus, and they don't need the spiky arms.
Well, and in fact, some insects that are, this is usually more for, like, spores and really microscopic things, but will have comb-like appendages.
Yes.
So they could have little, like, finger-like appendages.
Exactly. So they could have kind of a more hand-shaped end to their praying mantis arm instead of these spikes, these scary spikes. Because if they're not hunting, then they don't need a spiky arm to grab onto prey with. You now need to manipulate food and manipulate your garden.
Yes. And if they have their big eyes and they're very visual, they won't have very prominent antennae, which mantises tend not to, because they are such a visual group of organisms.
Yep. Oh, man.
This is cool. I like this one. I like that we did bugs.
Yes.
Because that was one where it's like, are we going to get to do bugs with tiny monsters? Because bugs are so hard to do monsters in.
Well, when I was taking the notes and I got to the termites just being mentioned over and over and over again with the arid fairy rings, I'm like, we can't just do termites again.
That's what I was going to say. Can't be termites. We already did termites.
Termites can't be all of our weird.
Can't be all of our. Once again, every monster in the series is a mimic octopus.
Yes, secretly.
Secretly a mimic octopus.
Even we didn't know.
We the hosts are ourselves cephalopods. So we've got colonial fungus farming mantis fairies.
I like it.
That's super cool.
I like that.
That's a very fun concept.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Oh man, they like I haven't seen them yet, but they're so cute in my head.
Well, I like another thing that I like about this one is, like the gremlins from last episode, these can easily be creepy.
Yes,
like very easily. You can easily see somebody going, "Oh, look, a cute little fairy," but also it's a bug.
Yeah,
it's a little creepy with its little hands and its neck that turns like a mantis's neck. It's like that. This could easily be either adored by people for being cute or demonized for being ugly and creepy.
Yep. Well, it's have you seen Pan's Labyrinth?
Yes.
Yeah. Their fairies are kind of leaf insect-esque.
Yeah.
Theirs were insectoid, and theirs had that where it's like, yeah, you're a pretty little shaped like a flower, but then you're also like, you got an exoskeleton and you're making noises.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, you're a little creepy. This is absolutely, it would be within the eye of the beholder and the situation. Like, when you see it picking up crumbs, it's adorable. When you step into their fairy ring and you get swarmed by them, less adorable.
Oh, these are fairies that you don't want any of the pixie dust.
No, absolutely
The pixie dust is spores.
Yeah.
You don't want that.
It'll make you fly, but you will you will be in the hospital.
I do like the image of like of one of these flying around and just like in the right light, you can see this trail of dust coming off of it. And it's like, no, those are just spores.
Yep.
It's just releasing fungal spores.
Yep.
There are fungi that will hitch a ride on flying insects to spread their spores.
That's cool.
That's great.
Growth.
Listen, they got to be creepy. It's spooky.
Absolutely.
We will do cute stuff later.
I love them. If you all have ideas or opinions about fairies, or if there are any like specific fairies that you have ideas for, because I did not go into any of the specific like gnomes
and the high grade
brownies. I did not dive into any of those, so I don't even have thoughts. If you have ideas or how these could be applied to other specific fairies, I'd love to hear if it's like other ways that they could fit well.
As we've mentioned before, on our Discord, there is a special channel for Spook-E where you can put ideas, chat with other listeners. Also, if you do any fan art, sometimes our listeners like to make little art of our spooky creations, and we love to see those.
They're so good.
Please share them with us if you do.
You can share them on the Discord. You can also post them elsewhere. Just tag us if you want us to see them. And if you are cool with us putting it up on our website, we have a fan art page on the website and a section for Spook-E. Just let us know if you're cool with that and let us know how you'd like to be tagged.
Yeah. There are 2 more episodes of Spook-E for October, 2 more Saturdays to go, 2 more episodes, then Cutie, and the Spook-E live stream.
Woo!
So we got a lot coming out. So, hey, listen.
Yeah, big things aren't in the future because this is Tiny Monsters, but stay tuned.
Tiny things.
Bye. Clap, Peter.
Clap. Clap, everybody. Clap if you believe.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.